All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to Sociology 296 Urban Sociology. And I am Professor Stewart, your instructor for the winter semester. I hope that you are having a great start to your day and to your semester of learning. So, to begin, we're going to talk about several things as we get going with the course this semester. I will say a few things about myself just to get that going, and then we'll go into more about the course, particularly its history at the college, what urban sociology is and what it isn't, and also we'll talk about urban issues and have a beginning framework for how we can examine urban issues. And going on, we'll talk more about the readings for the week and the week's discussion board. All right, so to begin, a bit about me. I am a Michigander, a Michiganian in terms of course, where I live now. I've lived in Michigan for 16 and a half years. However, Pennsylvania is my home state, where I also lived for up to, I guess it was around 16 or so years that I lived there. And I, yes, generally was born and raised in Pennsylvania outside of Philly, in a town, a suburb of Philly called Chester, Pennsylvania. So that's where I ultimately am from and am from Delaware County. And I have since moved. And again, I had mentioned before, I've been a Pennsylvanian for 16 years, from birth to 16. And then at that time, my family and I, we moved, my siblings, my mom, we moved to North Carolina. We moved to Charlotte. So right then, my life kind of became a natural experiment of, in a sense, being raised in one part of the country in one kind of city, and then moving to another part of the country and being, in a sense, continuing my maturation in another part of the country in a different city. And so moving to Charlotte and then staying in Charlotte through high school and then through college at UNC Charlotte, that gave me a fertile ground to explore a lot of my curiosities about cities, about regions, about why some cities look one way versus another, and what's the connection between life in cities in terms of quality of life, depending on the kind of person you are, in terms of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. And what does it mean when a city sprawls and has a very complicated network of streets that wind and that twist, and what does it mean when a city is a bit more traditional and laid out more like a grid? So that was a way of sort of delving into the issues and getting a kind of hankering for a lot of what cities were all about. And so at UNC Charlotte, I studied a number of things. Like everybody that goes to school, you take your gen ed classes, you learn about a lot of different subjects, from music to biology to women's studies. It's all there. Sociology, however, really became my hub. It became my way of really understanding and viewing the world in a way to come of age and make sense out of things as an African American male. And cities and urban sociology just made sense. I remember it was pretty early, probably around the time I had decided to be a sociology major, in my late sophomore into junior year. Yeah, it took me a little while, but again, a lot of that is normative, and you'll see that, of course, in a lot of your own experiences. But it was around that time that, yeah, I started reading a really interesting book by Joe Fagan, Free Enterprise City. And that book taught me a lot about Houston, Texas. And I had never been to Houston at that point in my life. And so it was written so well, and it gave me just a real sense of, okay, well, what's Houston all about? But also, what are Sunbelt cities in the New South? What are those areas of the country really all about? So Fagan really sort of lit a fire under me in terms of how and what he had written about Houston. And that was probably the beginnings of when I decided that I would be an urban sociologist, and I would focus more on what happened to and within cities. And so one thing led to another, where I graduated from UNC Charlotte, and then I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC, for my MA in sociology, and did research for my MA on the northwest side of Chicago, looking at race and culture within a particular urban context. So yeah, I've had some experiences with different cities. And again, I've been here in Michigan for the last 16 and a half years, having lived in Flint for 9 years and living in Genesee County, I should say, for 10. And now I live in Oakland County, where I've been for the last 6 years. So got a lot of different experiences with different parts of the country and different cities. And again, I am a Michiganian and a Michigander. This is my home, which in a lot of respects, and I see that now, especially socially and politically, that in a lot of ways, Pennsylvania, my home state, and Michigan, my adoptive state, they're very, very, very similar. They have a lot more in common than I think most people realize. And again, I think with a lot of what we've seen politically over the last few years, especially within this past year, has really, for me, shown a lot of the symmetry between these two places. So that gives you a good sense of who I am and what I bring to sociology, this course. And we can now talk a little bit more about the history of the course at Mott. And so we've had urban sociology on the books really ever since. It's been on the books for quite some time. I'd have to go back and look at the official registrar's records, but it's certainly been here since uh, the entire, if you will, 16 and a half years that I've been at Mott. And it hadn't been taught for a while when I arrived at the college in the fall of 2004. And so that was one of the interesting things about taking the position. I thought, wow, they've got so many unique sociology courses, and you don't usually see this at a community college. And so it was just fascinating just to kind of rifle through all that online at the time as I was preparing to teach or to come to the college and to move here to teach. And I just thought, wow, that would be a great course to end up teaching and to get to teach. And so indeed, that's what I had set about doing and was able to get started in the winter of 2005. That was the first time that I had taught personally the urban sociology course. And it was just a great experience, just being in being a Genesee County resident at the time, being a Flint resident, and to be a part of this community and an effort to ultimately draw attention to issues that I not only held dear, but that were incredibly important in terms of understanding the social world, and particularly that for students at Mott and within Genesee County. So at the same time, although that the course and my teaching of it got off to a good start back in '05. We had a good 5 year run, roughly, maybe 6 year run. I'll have to go back and look and see about the specifics and the particulars. But after a while, the course just didn't go as easily. It didn't get regular enough people, if you will, to keep it going when we put it on the schedule. So, alas, needless to say, perhaps, but still important that to note that this is really the first time we've taught urban sociology in about a decade. And I owe that a lot to in a sense, the absence perhaps has built an urgency to take the course, but also a lot of the issues that are currently happening politically and socially and economically in our cities. And a lot of what we saw in the summer of 2020 with respect to civil unrest happening in cities, what some people think of as the second civil rights movement. I'm wondering if that's what, for a lot of you, has brought your attention to the course and has brought you to it. So I, within that, greatly appreciate you signing up for the course, and I hope that I will do you proud in terms of providing the education and the experience with the course that you hope to have, that in a lot of respects can contextualize some of these more recent events that we've seen happen around the country, particularly in our cities, in terms of life and conditions for African Americans, for Latinos, for people of color generally, in terms of their lack of resources and empowerment, particularly in terms of how they're treated in cities by its institutions, especially the criminal justice system and policing. All right, so we've talked about me, we've talked about the course, we've talked about its history at the college. Now we need to talk a little bit more about what urban sociology is. And so, in a fancy way, or perhaps a simple way, it's really the sociology of cities. And so, it's really looking at cities as an intact, sort of inherent social milieu or organism. That's how the early human ecologists thought of a lot of what happened in the city. They thought of it as this sort of living organism, and that the relationships between people within cities, that they could be depicted and shown spatially. And so, indeed, a lot of those early sociologists at the Chicago School of Urban Sociology in the 1920s, so 100 years ago, a lot of these pioneering ways of looking at cities, particularly, were adopted and solidified at, if you will, the Chicago School of Urban Sociology at U of C. Um, so that's really what urban sociology is all about, sort of how they grasped it. They said, all right, well, cities are an arrangement of groups that have relationships that together are coherent, and they sustain this entirety, this whole of what this creation of a city actually is. And that led them to, again, plot that, depict that, find a way to demonstrate that, and to show that spatially. That a lot of the Chicago School of Urban Sociology also around that time had to contend with some of the myths, some of the inherent perceptions that people tend to have of cities, regardless of whether or not they study them as sociologists. Um, so that became part of the emergence of urban sociology as a field too, in terms of, well, how do we really perceive cities? Are we able to perceive them and to truly show and demonstrate what's happening to cities without being judgmental, without saying, well, that's what they get and that's what they deserve for being in such an environment? So we'll be talking a little bit more about that too, from not only this point on, but going forward throughout the course as well. Uh, we also have to kind of look at what urban sociology is not. Although we study cities, we do not rank cities. We do not say that one city is better than another, or that there's a best or worst city for everybody. And so that's something that within the popular press, what some people might term pop sociology, that's something that you might see happen there, where maybe in a magazine, and we'll take a look at this with one of our assignments this semester. Sometimes websites, magazines, publications, be they devoted to travel, to lifestyle, sometimes they'll talk about best places to live in the USA, or top cities for this kind of person or that kind of person. It's always interesting because um, it's really pretty astounding that you could reduce, if you will, all these incredibly complicated cities to a best and worst list, in a sense. And that's another thing too. Conversely, there are lists of the so-called worst cities. Um, Sociology and sociologists just do not get into that. That would not be ethical. And again, our job and our focus is really to try to understand these places. But it's important that we're going to, work with some of the, if you will, logic of that, of, well, the best and worst. But we're going to look at things much more globally in terms of, well, um, what happens in cities between different groups of people? What are the data? What do the data tell us? And so that's ultimately what we are invested in, is in a sense finding out what are the lived experiences, what are the daily experiences of urban life, and how can we show that within the data, the demographics and such that we have. But again, that's a resounding no, that we do not rank, rate, or have some other way of judging or evaluating cities as being one way or another. So that is not something that urban sociology or sociology generally does. Uh, Also, we have to keep in mind that there are a number of different fields that are related to sociology and urban sociology that are also, if you will, part of the process of looking at cities. So there's urban studies, there's urban planning and policy, there's public administration. So those are examples of unique fields that also have been in the throes of looking at the inner workings of cities and how they function. But again, we're often within those fields looking at different levels of scale, looking at different kinds of assumptions or even different properties of how the, if you will, those fields may be organized. And so in a lot of respects, what we do is much more, in a sense, inherently conceptually and theoretically based. It may not be as applied, if you will, as fields like urban affairs or urban studies or urban planning or policy, or even African American studies, wherein you're often looking at urban issues as well. But at times, some of those fields can be a bit more on the applied side. And so, nevertheless, with the different distinctions, and sometimes these can even be subtle, if not great differences. Um, Sociology is related, is connected to those fields, and often is a convener with respect to the research on those, or within those fields on cities. So we're connected, but at the same time, we have a very, very different sort of goal, a different lens of really uh, an attempt to understand cities, an attempt to understand urban life is ultimately what urban sociology is all about. All right, so we now need to look at sort of our first chapter and some of what it entails with respect to our material this semester. And so we're going to talk really to begin with about how we examine urban issues. And that immediately has to and brings to mind perceptions. Well, what do we perceive or what do we sense that cities are all about? And so there are a number of myths about what cities are ultimately about. And so at times, throughout history and even into the present, cities are sort of regarded as a necessary evil. Well, we have to tolerate them, is sort of the way that often cities have been regarded. And so a lot of this, in a sense, research shows that this is rooted in our colonial history. And so the early settlers, if you're looking at colonial America, this colonial outpost of England, they wanted small town life and small town living. Often that was seen as ideal, these sort of bucolic pastoral settings that were ethereal, that was the way the real life was supposed to be. As much as that may have been valued, and again, you can't objectively say whether that's better or worse than a bustling large city, at the same time, just developing the society that we were developing and becoming the society that we were eventually becoming, um, the goods and services that we needed, the trade that experienced or was experienced in those cities really kept us from being and remaining at that small bucolic level. And so that's where the rub lies, that these may be cherished norms, small town life and small town living. However, the desire ultimately to create that and maintain that tends to lead to larger cities and larger clusterings of people. Another myth is that the good life only exists in small towns, and that the city life is not the good life, and that if you really want it, kind of like we had said about the cities being a necessary evil, yeah, some think, hey, if you really want to live the good life, you got to get away, you got to live further away. And again, think about what we said about the urban unrest of, if you will, the last half year, for instance, and what we've seen happen in our cities and what we even saw happening in Washington, D.C. just a couple of days ago. Some people say that, hey, again, with these long-standing mythologies, they may use those events as being exemplary of, hey, I got to get out of here. This is where I should be. However, rural communities also have their own entrenched structural problems. And so there's been a lot of talk within sociology and other fields about a rural brain drain, and that often rural youth, once they emerge into early young adulthood, they tend not to want to stay in those smaller rural bucolic so-called cities. That often the first thing that they want to do is declare their independence by going to a state college or a state university, and then using that as their sort of meal ticket to leave that rural environment that probably doesn't really hold that much stimulation for them. So that becomes another set of issues that we see happening. And so in a lot of respects, currently in our society, we have a rural urban divide. And a lot of that is overlaid with what we're seeing happening politically between the political parties, between Democrats and Republicans. And we're looking at resources not being equally shared or equally distributed, some of these being political resources and some of these being economic and cultural ones. And so there'll probably be more to talk about on that later, but in a lot of respects, that's also in the background of the events that we've seen happening within the American presidency and Congress and other, if you will, political churning and juxtapositions we've seen over the last 4 or so years. Another myth that we also have to contend with, and some people erroneously suspect and consider, is that people often believe that the city, any city in this country, particularly one of a significant size or stature, is mostly comprised of poor people and poor residents. And the vast majority of cities, whether we're looking at New York, Chicago, Flint, Detroit, Los Angeles, Birmingham, the vast majority of cities have a range of neighborhoods and a range of, if you will, in a sense, income and social class dynamics. And so the idea that these cities are always, or that they are universally, uniformly poor, is one that has been debunked over and over and over again, but nevertheless, stereotypes still often remain. And then that's closely related to another notion that the cities are violent, that they're disorderly places, that as soon as you hit the city limits, bad things are just going to be cascading about, and that they're just going to happen indiscriminately. The vast majority of research overwhelmingly shows that urban crimes are disproportionately crimes of property, not crimes of violence directed towards persons. And so again, if you've got a bunch of people living around each other, it's sensible in a sense that property crime would bubble up from that, because again, you've got with that greater opportunity because there's just more property, if you will, to commit crime with or on. Often research shows, and this is something that overwhelmingly resounds within sociology, that often crime of one kind or another, regardless of whether it's violent or if it's property crime, overwhelmingly it's a response to a lack of legitimate economic opportunity. If there aren't jobs that are readily available to have for those who are hardworking and willing to do so, that pay enough to be gainful, then crime becomes a rational choice. And so the research has borne that out within urban sociology resoundingly. At the same time, we also have to keep in mind cities are incredibly ordered. Yes, the mail is picked up. UPS and DoorDash and other kinds of gig economy jobs get to traverse city neighborhoods just as swiftly and just as easily as they do suburban areas and suburban neighborhoods. That city neighborhoods are infused with parks, they're infused with community centers, third places that bring people together. And so the idea that cities are just automatically devoid of these things is just really, really, truly a non-starter. And then probably among these, one of the more disturbing myths is that the city is a dying place, or that cities are just not going to last. And so research shows that of the 20 largest U.S. cities, 14 gained population during the 1990s, with 2.5 times as many people moving into the cities that gain population than those losing population. Not to mention, some of our ideas about what a city is need to change a little bit. That sure, the boundaries of the boundaries of a city like Atlanta or a city like Flint or a city like Detroit may show that within the city, over years, over decades, that the population within those areas shrunk. But at the same time, if you look at the metro areas circumscribing that city, often those are the areas that truly gained those former city residents. And so in a lot of respects, those boundaries of, okay, this is where Flint is, and this is where Genesee County is, or this is where Atlanta is, and this is where Fulton County is, a lot of those divides don't really hold up if we think of truly how people live and behave and breathe, and where they tend to sort of allow their lives to naturally kind of collect and to sort of spread out. And so we need to really talk more about regions and regional economics and regional urban studies and regional urban sociology, and not simply looking at only what's happening within the city limits. All right. So that was a mouthful. Email me if you've got questions, because sometimes I can go kind of fast. Thankfully, this is being recorded, so you can always stop and stuff like that, and go back. Now we need to just shed light more on some contemporary, some modern urban issues. One of the things that we can find and often notice in a city is how it's laid out often has a lot to say and demonstrate about power and about privilege and about which groups have access to power and privilege and which groups are subordinated. And so uh, the writer Mike Davis did a good job of capturing this when he wrote about the Forbidden City, sort of, if you will, his sense of the Forbidden City as it related to downtown Los Angeles. And so he talked about how Los Angeles developed and grew a sort of new downtown, a new urban planning design architectural approach. And so as much as it had been raved about and heralded about, Davis was able to show that in a lot of respects, the new structures were basically incredibly almost universally privatized, that they were overwhelmingly separate from public navigation, that they were difficult to reach or traverse on foot. And so you have these linked structures that don't offer or provide access to the outside world. And so it becomes sort of a city within a city, is what he was talking about, if you will. And in some respects, we can see that even here in Michigan. And so if you look at, if you will, the riverfront of Detroit, you have a number of buildings there, like the Renaissance Center, that are widely known and respected as representing not only the city of Detroit, but also its heritage, its identity, and also its location as an international border and an entryway, if you will, to the United States. But even there, traversing that area, trying to get back and forth off Jefferson, if you will, into the building itself and the different structures, a lot of what was embedded in the building in terms of retail is not really at the foot traffic level. And so there you've got that sense of privatization, and even how the Renaissance Center is actually uh, constructed and where it actually sits, just, if you will, in a sense, aside Jefferson, if you will, the way that is kind of makes it more separate from the rest of Detroit's downtown. It's like, well, we have to treat this building differently, or we have to do something differently about this place. And it's not as well integrated into the grid pattern or the street pattern of the other parts of downtown Detroit, like Greektown is, for instance. And that, although the building and the structure, of course, of the Renaissance Center has been heralded, they have been embraced. At the same time, we've had to work harder at making that a reality in terms of how people really experience the building on the day-to-day basis. So again, a lot of what Mike Davis said is not simply true for what happened to Los Angeles and its, in a sense, older downtown versus its newer downtown environment. All right. Another thing we can talk about in terms of examining urban issues and some of the problems therein in terms of how groups and unique types of individuals are treated, one way we can look at that is through the lens of homelessness. And so research has shown within urban sociology that often ordinances that are put on the books for cities often punish or harass the homeless or effectively reduce them and make them into criminals. And so there may be legislation or rules created to limit the use of public space for living. So if someone's sleeping on these steps or if they're sleeping by this particular public building, they may be subject to arrest. They may easily be victims of selective law enforcement laws that are on the books that really only seem to be there for folks who are indeed homeless. And granted, certainly there is a need to protect and promote safety and openness and the fair treatment of public space and the individuals within it, regardless of whether they're homeless or not. But at the same time, often the onus is on sweeping the homeless away and making the city look better without their presence, and instead of providing services and ultimately an urban environment that reduces the possibility of being homeless. Right? And one of the last things I want to talk about in this regard is environmental racism and environmental justice. And this is also an area that's very connected to urban sociology that in a lot of respects is both theoretical and applied and may involve researchers and policymakers from a variety of different fields. And so within this field, we're looking at the concept ultimately of environmental racism being incredibly important and significant and galvanizing. And so by environmental racism, we're talking about any policy, practice, or directive that disadvantages individuals or groups or communities based upon their race or color. And so a great example of this, and you'll be looking at it this week, is what happened in the case of New Orleans, in the city of New Orleans with respect to Hurricane Katrina 15 and a half years ago. And so you'll look at a segment of the film When the Levees Broke from Spike Lee, which does an incredible job of chronicling the incredible layers of toxicity and environmental racism that ultimately were spewed forth and released and unleashed during the experience of Hurricane Katrina back in August of 2005. So you'll look at that, and also this week, in addition to the lecture and notes, you're also going to be looking at a couple of excerpts from social historian Andrew Highsmith. He's actually a social urban historian, or urban social historian, I would say. Great guy, wrote a real good book called Demolition Means Progress, and looking really at Flint's urban social history, if you will, the urban social history of the city of Flint. And it came out just as the Flint water crisis was becoming truly a matter of public awareness and a matter of public knowledge. And so his book is a great gift to the city of Flint and to Genesee County. So I highly, 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 highly encourage you to read that book when you get a chance. But I have a few excerpts of it too here that are going to be consistent with what we're talking about in our first week, in our beginning first chapter. So with that, I hope that you enjoy your very first week in our course, and I bid you adieu.